So there I was, knuckles deep in a bunch of tiny parts, kneeling beside a trail just a few miles outside of Boise, Idaho, on an early summer morning with my mostly trustworthy mule Richard tied up beside me as I worked desperately to fix a piece of equipment that would either enable me to pull off something new and great or leave me failing. If failure was the outcome, I'd be subjected to explaining that failure face to face to countless expectant strangers, one after another, for hours as the morning unfolded. Worse yet, the only other person with me at that moment was the outdoor reporter for our state's largest newspaper, the Idaho Statesman. On that morning, I was in earnest pursuit, as I still am, of the American dream, and feeling a little bit of the inherent struggle that accompanies anyone going down that path. Welcome to the Behind the Mules podcast. I'm here to explore what the American dream really is and share the journeys of the people and small businesses who have gone in pursuit. Why is it called Behind the Mules? Because being behind a mule can be a necessary and worthwhile endeavor when pursuing the American dream, plowing and productively toiling towards the vision of something grander. Being behind a mule can also come with dangers, with derailing train wrecks, and even when there isn't catastrophe, on occasion, unpleasant things can be discovered out the backside of a mule, and maybe even stepped in. I'm here to pull out the stories of struggle, success, failure, dumb luck, and the true grit involved in running a small business. This podcast series is brought to you in part by Café Mulé Coffee. If you're a grocery shopper living between Alaska and Iowa, you may be fortunate enough to be sipping on some Café Mulé coffee right now. If you live anywhere in the US and have internet access, you can get yourself some smooth, easy drinking coffee at cafemule.com, spelled just like Cafe Mule. CAFEMULE.com. Growing this coffee company with my partner and team has been part of my own personal pursuit of the American dream. And I'm proud that we get to share breakfast with thousands of people every morning, while keeping the lights on, supporting outdoor causes, and employing a great group of people, one mule and one donkey, who all love what they do. You will find some of our stories intermixed into this podcast. You will also hear about our new adventures with Café Mulé Farms. But now, we need to start working our way back to that early summer morning in 2016. Kneeling beside a trail with a bunch of tiny parts in my hand, though the roots of that situation likely started taking hold decades before, all the way back to the 8th grade. I was a smart kid and got good grades. I was reasonably athletic, read here, quite a bit of heart, but not massively coordinated, but I was also one of the smallest kids in my class. There was never a chance I was going to be a first-round pick in any gym class team selection, and I was real frequently getting shoved around on the bus, at recess, and in the halls. This didn't sit well with me, and despite what I felt were usually low odds of my personal success in the outcome, facing bigger kids, more kids, just plain meaner kids, I often fought back out of a sense of justice and disdain for people leveraging advantages they hadn't earned. I didn't choose to be born small, and I sure know by the 8th grade, none of those kids did anything to make themselves big. They didn't come by it out of effort, just luck. In the right light, 3 decades later, I can still make out the scar of one of my asshole classmates' teeth on one of my knuckles. I got my nose broke for the first time in junior high in a fight that seemed to last for 5 minutes, after one of our school's urchins stood squarely in front of me with his buddies and hawked a loogie in my face from 2 feet away. I'm not necessarily condoning fighting, but there are just certain times in life. And as an aside, this would also be the first of 3 times I'd break my nose. Only 2 of those were due to fists, and I've learned 1, I have a big nose, and 2, When you have such a big nose, you can never have too much practice in blocking fists or even immovable objects from hitting you in the face. I've been fortunate at times in my life to receive some good mentorship. My 8th grade math teacher, Mrs. Snowden, had a certain way about her. She was one of those teachers who never yelled, but would calmly walk up to a student who was disrupting her class, lean in real close, and whisper something into their ear that almost always shut the situation down cold. Possibly, on maybe only 2 occasions, she had to whisper into my ear, and it was pretty benign, though I'm certain she told other kids that she had a finger and ear collection that she wore to bed on a necklace or had the corpses of former unruly math students buried in her backyard. That was the beauty of the calm whisper. To an onlooker, Mrs. Snowden didn't look angry at all. But really, she could say anything she wanted to a kid. Who would a school administrator believe? A motherly teacher of 20 plus years or a punk 8th grader? That kind of calm only comes with someone who has a real mastery of themselves and all around them. Now, Mrs. Snowden didn't see a lot of the things going on with me outside of the classroom, but I know she knew. She saw my success in class, but definitely sensed some of my struggles. She felt my anger, and she deftly rechanneled it towards a purpose. Mrs. Snowden asked me to come in before class one day, and when I arrived, she asked if I'd ever heard of the service academies: West Point, the Air Force Academy, the Naval Academy, Coast Guard Academy. Nope, I didn't have a clue, and they all seemed a long ways away from Wyoming. She proceeded to tell me that they were really hard to get into, harder than Harvard, required great grades and a lot of athletic and extracurricular involvement, but if I got accepted to one, it was an automatic free ride to a 4-year degree and a guaranteed job as a military officer. In small print, a 5-year commitment to serve my country upon graduation. She had me at its hard, and I immediately set my compass for a new azimuth. My family has Navy roots, with my great-grandfather having served shipboard as an enlisted sailor during World War I, and my father having been drafted during the Vietnam era. So Naval Academy it was. The Naval Academy also boosted a pretty cool list of alums: Jimmy Carter, Alan Shepard, the first American in space, Ross Perot, John McCain, and on the opposite end of the height and athletic scales for myself, Heisman Trophy winner Roger Staubach and basketball star David Robinson. High school became a very focused slog that involved many a late night studying for AP classes, a few years of speech and debate, some volunteering at my local VA, a bit of restaurant work, and 8 athletic seasons, 4 of which involved so much running. The mile and 2 mile didn't suck enough during my freshman year of track, so I thought I'd close out my K-12 education with 3 years of JV cross country. But alas, it worked. Senior year rolled around, and I got an official acceptance, also known as an appointment, to the United States Naval Academy. It came with a minimalist haircut, an active duty ID card, and some new clothing. 4 years of further academic anguish and daily psychological torture then ensued, and I graduated in 2003. Breaking with family tradition, I decided to take a not so well-known option of commissioning as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I became a Marine Corps second lieutenant in May 2003, and if you remember, we were still very rattled from 9/11, and we were fairly concerned at the time that dictators with irresponsibly large mustaches, even more irresponsibly sized egos, and who had a history of nerve-gassing their own people, probably shouldn't have all those weapons of mass destruction that we just knew were buried under those desert sands somewhere. The war was very much on.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines.
By early 2005, I'd graduated from 2 fairly lengthy and strenuous Marine Corps schools, and it was my turn to get into the fray. On my first deployment, I was sent to Ramadi in the western part of Iraq to help construct camps for the new Iraqi army. Despite my 19 years of schooling up to this point, I was about to get some of the best education possible and gain perspectives that will never leave me. I lived in a very small, former Iraqi military building with 6 other Americans, but spent the entirety of most days and the majority of my meals as the lone U.S. service member with 20 to 30 Iraqi workers who were providing the food, generator power, sanitation, etc. for the hundreds of Iraqi soldiers that lived on the camps we built and sustained. The Iraqis I worked with were enterprising and capitalist to the core. Seeing opportunity with the U.S. invasion in 2003, a few of them had worked their way from being truck drivers in support of the U.S. effort to managing their own construction companies within only a few years. This moment in their lives, for some of them for the first time in their lives, effort equaled direct reward for them. They were also resourceful. I saw MacGyver-esque solutions cobbled together on a near daily basis. If you own a vehicle and don't believe that you could pull over and start welding with your car battery at any point you'd like, you just haven't lived, or at least been forced to live resourceful enough. Though disclaimer here, this method of welding comes with some hazards that can include explosions and getting covered in acid. I'm not recommending it, and shoes are always optional with this technique, as I've witnessed firsthand. One time, in less than 2 days, I watched a single person convert a bathroom in an abandoned building into a bakery that could put out over 1,000 pieces of bread a day. Minus 2 large clay vessels, the entirety of the ovens was built on the spot from very basic materials, and it all could be powered by an old bicycle pump used to pressurize diesel fuel in the event we ran out of propane. I gained a significant amount of respect for those around me, but more importantly, I was schooled in culture. Day in and day out, meal by meal, meeting by meeting. There's a fairly large gulf between American and Iraqi culture at times, and in the dangers of an insurgency and with sectarian violence always looming, sometimes it seemed we were working under different systems of logic. But I learned to understand people's incentives, their motives, and that always made things a lot clearer. I would carry this curiosity in and focus on incentives with me, helping me understand a lot of situations to come. One cultural practice that is impressive that I have also tried to carry with me is the Iraqi sense of hospitality. The first cup of chai tea I was offered in Iraq was by a random truck driver. I was green with only a few days in country when I happened to be walking amongst a bunch of parked semis, looking for one that was bearing supplies for the camp I'd just been informed I was supposed to sustain and continue building, when a truck driver kneeling in the shade of his semi-trailer motioned me over. From the toolbox of his truck, he produced a small burner, a kettle, some loose-leaf black tea, copious amounts of sugar, and a real glass cup and saucer that somehow survived a continual life of abuse on some of the roughest roads known to man. It was clear that the number of cups he traveled with was 1, and the number of teeth in his mouth didn't number too many more, which gave me a bit of pause with our shared glassware situation and the limitations of local water and truckside washing. But the military had given me pretty much every vaccine known to man, in triplicate, and I figured, you only live once. We proceeded. He made tea, and I drank it, and it was a great decision. At this point, my Arabic was as basic as his English, and it seemed he had a mastery of about a dozen English words. But the tea was excellent, and I learned that this was the thing. You sit, you drink, you just acknowledge being in one another's presence as humans, building something, some connection, even if you can't fully communicate. This would be the first of countless cups of tea I would drink, and it would set me up for success on my next deployment, where my platoon of 40 Marines and I were frequently patrolling and searching homes in towns across western Iraq. On many occasions, I'd be invited to sit and share tea with people who maybe didn't like what I stood for, an occupying military force in their eyes, and who surely found my presence inconvenient, if not intrusive, in their homes. Yet with warmth, I'd be offered some tea, I'd accept and share anything I had to reciprocate, and we'd find a way to connect. To breeze through some years here, I got out of the Marine Corps in 2008 and went to business school. I appreciated the education but realized corporate life wasn't for me. So soon after getting my MBA, I took a commission in the Army National Guard. I subsequently tried out for and was selected for the Army Special Forces, and after much more schooling, served for a few years as a Green Beret. On a South America deployment, I once again was witness to a lot of tea consumption and the connection it could bring. It seems this wasn't just a Middle Eastern concept. This time the tea was yerba mate, and every morning I would watch circles of people standing outside or in office buildings or even in cars and buses form around a common mate cup that would be recharged and passed from person to person. And often, I'd be standing nearby on the outside and invited into those circles. All those cups of tea over the years and witnessing the connections they forged planted a seed in me. There was something beautiful about a group of people taking a few minutes out of their day and sharing something basic but enjoyable. It struck me that Americans didn't have the same sort of social beverage and custom of gathering around one. When I left the military for good in 2015 and joined my family to settle down in Boise, Idaho, I wanted to bring this experience to my own community, but with a twist: coffee and served outdoors. The 190 miles of non-motorized trails in the foothills above Boise seemed like the perfect venue. Not only could they be a very common meeting place for people from many walks of life, but serving coffee on the trails would encourage a bit of running, biking, or hiking. I was trying to kill two birds with one stone: bring people together and build community, and get people active. Oh, and on the trails with me, out of necessity and as an extra attraction beyond coffee, there would be something else. Even the most basic coffee setup to serve 100 or more people: table, stove, fuel, kettles, water, especially water, weighs a few hundred pounds and takes up quite a bit of space. Being that the trails around Boise are mostly non-motorized, I couldn't drive my supplies to the serving location. And despite all my past training in carrying ungodly heavy gear, I couldn't carry it all in one trip, or even 3 by myself. What was a guy to do? I turned to Craigslist and I started mule shopping. Richard the Mule was the eventual outcome, and I'm sure we'll talk more about him in future episodes, as he ultimately sort of stole the show. Now, you would think that serving coffee to people in a cool outdoor location would be widely accepted, and it truly was. Everyone I shared this idea with wanted to be a part of it and saw it as something that would enhance their trail experience. Except for the local bureaucrats, that is. Our trail system in Boise occupies land controlled by the city, county, BLM, or Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and the Fish and Game, who all meet quarterly and set policies for the trails together as part of a working group called Ridge to Rivers. There was no Ridge to Rivers policy in place regarding what I intended to do, but being the rule follower I often am, I reached out to this group in December of 2015, 6 months out from when I intended to start serving coffee, and I asked the group's director if I needed any permits. He let me know that this was an item that would have to be considered by the group at a quarterly meeting. So I asked if he could let me know when the next meeting would be, and I waited. Hearing nothing for a few months, I checked back in early February 2016, and as it turned out, Ridge to River's next quarterly meeting was set to be held the very next day. The director told me they'd consider my request at the meeting, at which point I invited myself to attend. I presented 10 specific trail locations near Boise, all on BLM land for simplicity in this group's consideration of my request. And as it worked out, most of the trails on BLM land were far enough away from the city to not be a bother to other trail users if a crowd assembled, and they also would require anyone attending to put in a mile or two of effort to get there, which was a big plus in my books. Coffee tastes better after a few exercise-induced endorphins start flowing. These BLM lands above Boise are surrounded by beautiful vistas of the city below and transition to alpine lands above. But they aren't exactly the world's most coveted lands themselves or a pristine wilderness. They are grass and sage scrublands that have been nearly taken over by noxious skeleton weeds in the past decades. Interspersed with a patchwork of private held lands, they are often too frequently trafficked by people on the popular trail network to be prime habitat areas for lots of wildlife as well. I believe all land should be respected and preserved, but I mention this as an important context for what I'm about to relay. As the meeting unfolded and my request was brought before the group, there was much and near immediate hand-wringing. The BLM district manager said he was willing to make a decision on my request, but I'd have to use trails that crossed land controlled by the other agencies in order to get to BLM land, so he wanted these land managers' consensus first. That is a roundabout way of saying he wasn't actually willing to make the decision. And the concern that I would have to travel trails on city, county, and Forest Service land with my mule probably wasn't a real genuine concern, as much as a tactic if we're going to be frank. All of the trails crossing those other agencies' land already and always had allowed for use with horses. But then the BLM manager pointed out that I'd be in one place for 4 to 6 hours with my mule while I was serving coffee. And in that case, he would have to get his botanists, archaeologists, and wildlife experts involved to make sure this lone mule plan would pass a National Environmental Protection Agency assessment. Again, I am in no uncertain terms all about protecting land and wildlife habitat, but these same BLM lands where I propose to operate are grazed every year by thousands of sheep, with herders who camp on site with their sheep for weeks. And these shepherds always have a handful of, guess what? Mules with them. These mules are left to do whatever they want, whenever they want, for a lot longer than 4 to 6 hours. Maybe because there was a sense from the group that their evidence was shaky. At some point during this conversation, the National Forest District Ranger interjected that it would take her 3 years to even get around to considering my proposal, given her current workload. I thought we were actually in the meeting right then to consider the proposal, but I was sadly mistaken. This all just seemed like a smokescreen, and it was part of an all too familiar playbook of deter, delay, and make it go away that I was becoming familiar with. Muleside coffee was something I just wanted to do for fun, for my community in Boise. Selling coffee beside a remote trail had many limiting factors, and it wasn't going to make me rich. With my time accounted for, it was never even going to break even. I knew that. I had actually planned for a broader business around my small but mighty mule packing operation in 2016. My wife is an ultra runner, and I was working towards a much grander plan of being able to support training runs for groups of up to 20 runners on the weekends on various mountain trails in the broader region of southwest Idaho. I had seen from my wife and her friends that it is hard to have a fulfilling run of 20 to 30 miles or more and carry all of the food and water needed to go the distance. It's possible, but certainly less enjoyable to toil along with a pack than to spirit yourself down the trail with maybe a water bottle and a gel slipped into your pocket. My plan of operations was to collect drop bags from runners who were signed up to train with us at some point before each weekend. These bags would include any snacks, extra water, gels, etc. that the runner might want on the run. I'd then provide the runners directions to a trailhead, a map, and a window of time for them to complete their training run that Saturday. Richard and I would head down the trail ahead of the runners and stage their supplies, their drop bags, at a few different predetermined locations. The runners would do an out and back run where I'd wait at the turnaround point. When the last runner turned, I'd follow behind them and pick up their drop bags and clear the trail of any trash. These wouldn't be races, runners didn't have to start at the same time, and there wouldn't be deep medical or communications infrastructure provided. Just logistical support to help some badass runners who can take care of themselves but would like more enjoyable long distance runs. Around the same time I started asking Ridge to Rivers for permission to serve coffee in the Boise Foothills, I had applied for an outfitter's license to organize these training trips and simultaneously had put in requests with 7 different Forest Service and BLM districts in the region to operate my running support business on their lands during the summer months. These were robust packets I submitted, with detailed plans and annotated maps laying out how I intended to operate, meaning there was a large upfront time expense on my part, as well as hundreds of dollars I had to lay out for an outfitter's license and required bonding. I knew this mule-supported training also wasn't going to be a path to riches, but I would be doing honest work in the outdoors, and this is what I sought. To be worthwhile at all, though, from a financial standpoint, I needed permission from at least a few of the BLM or Forest Service districts telling me I could operate before the summer months came, ideally with a little bit of lead time to do some marketing around this new service. After submitting these packets in December and January, I'd call the district offices every few weeks. Usually, they wouldn't connect me with anyone willing to tell me anything, or they'd just forward me to someone's line, which would inevitably go to voicemail. So I'd leave a message with the district manager or ranger. On the occasions I'd get a hold of a district ranger to ask when they might review my plan, or simply sit down with me to discuss it, as all of the Forest Service manuals told me they would do as an early point in the process, they'd start listing all the discouraging hurdles. Without looking at my actual request, they would start pointing out that they would need to open it up for public opinion, and then do an environmental assessment, and then maybe something or a dozen other things. In some instances, when the proposed trails were tens of miles from anything that looked like civilization, I'd ask who the public was going to be that would give a relevant opinion. No good answer was ever provided me. And then they'd always leverage the mule. Would my mule be allowed to graze while I stopped? If so, I might need a grazing permit. Understand, every area I propose to operate in allows unpermitted horse camping at any time. You can take a bunch of horses with you, or mules if you'd like, camp out, and let them graze to your heart's content. The Forest Service runs and contracts out its own large strings of mules that they operate on our lands, and at least one national forest in Idaho turns out a massive herd of its own mules to overwinter every year. And at the same time, most of the lands are requested to operate on are openly grazed by cattle every summer. I'm getting off track with this grazing business, but that really is sort of the point. This was such an obvious BS fabricated obstacle. I was taking my mule to pack, not graze, and we weren't even staying overnight. But as a few of the rangers seemed to be deeply concerned over, I couldn't promise Richard wouldn't take a trailside bite here and there, and that looks a lot like grazing. One Forest Service district ranger in a remote area a few hours from Boise challenged me on how I would prevent trail conflicts on one of the trails I had asked to use, and told me I needed to add some mitigating procedures to my request before he would consider it. So at his direction, I rewrote my plan to include signs posted at different trailhead locations on my use weekends, telling any and all that I would be supporting 20 trail runners and have a mule on the trail. Now I will admit here that for this particular trail, I selected it off of a map study in the wintertime. I'd never actually been on the trail because it was snowed over at the time I had to submit the application. Based off of the ranger's concern of possible trail conflicts, thought it must have been a busy trail though. When springtime came, I got up on the trail, and you literally would have needed a chainsaw and a machete to get through it. Nobody had maintained or traveled this trail in years. I'm fairly certain there wouldn't have been any conflicts there with other trail users, though the severity of the only possible conflict, collision of opposing machete-wielding hikers, could be severe, I guess. I'm also certain the Forest Service district ranger who was attempting to throw sand in my cogs had never been on the trail. My favorite response of all was when I asked one district ranger, after already having waited for months, when she could move forward and consider my special use permit. Her response, just real matter-of-fact like, was, "I just don't know. I really couldn't say." At least her colleague near Boise was willing to say she wouldn't look at anything for 3 years. 3 years does have the benefit of being a quantifiable time. I never checked, but I'm guessing that ranger was set to leave her post before that 3-year time frame was up. I've gone down an honest but negative path here, and I want to be clear. I hunt, fish, run, mountain bike, camp, and ride my mule from time to time, and I do these things almost exclusively on public lands. I love our American system of public lands, and I truly value the management services that our taxpayer dollars pay for and what is executed through entities like the Forest Service and BLM. In my book, it is money well spent. And as for our local entity, Ridge to Rivers, I love what they do too. Boise is an awesome place. Don't move here though. In large part because of the outdoor access we enjoy, and the trails are a part of that. Café Mulé, the coffee company I founded, donates a few $1,000s to Ridge to Rivers every year, and donates thousands more to 14 other trail maintenance entities spread out across the western states. We've donated 25 cents from every retail bag of coffee and bottle of cold brew we have ever sold under the Café Mulé brand. And we use our Draft Mule brand to donate to the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I was committed enough to the cause of maintaining trails and encouraging outdoor activity that in the first 3 years of my business, I was donating more money than I took home. No joke. Thanks to my loving wife, I suffered only minor starvation during this period. The mission of these government entities is good, as are a great deal of the rules they enforce. I've had a peek into life without rules. We want some rules and regulations, and that means we need some bureaucrats too, unfortunately. But I had to ask myself during these trying times why these bureaucrats I was dealing with were being so difficult. Put simply, as I learned to recognize so many years before in Iraq, it just all comes down to incentives. Unless you've founded a business and are sustaining it with deep family or outside wealth, running a small business is an eat what you kill type of situation. Business owners either produce and sell or get nothing. In a single person business or one with only a handful of staff, individuals may have to take on a number of roles. The lines between their roles are often non-existent, as are the bounds of their workdays. Sure, you can decide you don't want to prospect new accounts, or you don't want to answer that customer service email, or you don't want to pack off all those boxes. But if you don't do it, who will? There is nobody else. It's on you if you want to survive. Similarly, a small business owner can decide they only want to work 40 hours a week. But if 40 hours doesn't get the job done, you starve, plain and simple. If the work needs to go home, it goes home. If the work needs to happen all weekend, that's what must happen. As a person pursuing the American dream by building something from scratch, you make things happen over and over again by sheer will and follow through. I came to realize that the mid-level bureaucrats that I was interacting with from the BLM and Forest Service were operating in a completely different world than this eat what you kill situation I faced. In fact, every incentive they have is to say no to any request that would create even a little bit more work for themselves or anyone else in their organization. In fact, it's even better if they can discourage a request before even having to consider it and say no, as the act of officially saying no usually creates paperwork. It is sad that good enough for government work is an old and enduring adage, but it is a popular saying for a reason. Most government employees are given a well-defined set of duties, and short of negligence within those duties, they are hard to fire once hired. And extra duties are seen as just that, extra. Few government employees are staying late or working on the weekends to do those extras. Sure, mediocrity might not lead to rapid advancement, even in the government, but it will keep bringing home the bacon and get you a pension in many cases. I've seen this firsthand as a consultant to a government agency and having multiple family members and friends working for the government. These are truly great jobs for the benefit of the person with the job, but the incentives aren't always in place to ensure a great job is done. Was there anything in it for the BLM and Forest Service personnel I was submitting my request to actually process those special use permits? Would they get paid more for their extra work? Would they get more time off? Would they get a promotion? Not at all. Additionally, if they just shut me down cold, who was to know? In many cases, these individuals essentially controlled their own regional fiefdom. Nobody above them was tracking my requests. And even if they had been, creating more work for your boss, when your boss doesn't get paid more or benefit in any way for that extra work, doesn't put you in your boss's good graces. It just didn't make sense for these people to do anything for me, even if it was technically their job. There are for sure some great human beings who work hard within these organizations, who are service-oriented, who have integrity, and who fully respect the value of the taxpayer dollars they take home. But these people perform in spite of the incentives, not because of them. In the spring of 2016, a field manager from the BLM wrote to me concerning my request to serve coffee in the Boise Foothills. His letter stated that the BLM's, quote, governing land use plan does not expressly provide for allowing this type of service, unquote. And he went on to state again that he wouldn't make a decision without the rest of the Ridge to Rivers members, and at that time, there was a 10-year draft plan being considered that would not allow for my coffee operations. Who would have thought that the Bureau of Land Management plan would not have expressly envisioned a mule-side coffee service and set a policy for it? It was also very convenient that a plan still in draft phase just wasn't going to allow for what I was requesting. I thought the point of a draft was that it wasn't finished yet, and I was asking right then, or actually had asked months prior. At any rate, the BLM field manager closed his letter by expressly disapproving my request. It was strongly implied that he spoke for all Ridge to Rivers members in his denial. I seemed to not be left with many options at this point to serve coffee to my community on the trails. There were a few private landowners with properties in the Boise Foothills who had allowed trails to cross their lands. Ridge to Rivers personnel suggested I might reach out to these landowners and ask permission to use their land, but I later found out that the same Ridge to Rivers staff had contacted the private landowners behind my back and said something to the effect of, "There's a guy who may ask you for permission to sell coffee on your land, and if he reaches out, we'd really like to see you say no." Like academics, mid-level bureaucrats often fight so viciously because the stakes are just so low, at least low for them. Things were officially looking real grim, but I wasn't willing to be deterred just yet, and frankly, I was beyond pissed at this point with the stalling and discouragement tactics being employed by those holding all the power. And at least from where I stood, none of these people had done anything too exceptional to gain that power. If anything, they had all demonstrated an adept ability to shirk work. I started brainstorming. For good reason, I knew that the BLM and Forest Service regulations were heavily focused on permit requirements around any activity that made money. So I asked myself, what if I just don't make any money? I badly wanted to see groups of people enjoying a cup of coffee and one another in a cool outdoor venue. I had a feeling it would be something special, and I was invested at this point in that vision. I was also invested in a mule, a horse trailer, and a whole bunch of mule-related stuff. Sure, I jumped the gun a little bit, but you can't just wait until the day of to get these things together, so I'd had to hold out some hope and lean in. I started scouring regulations on a hunch that things might be different if I didn't charge money. And sure enough, within the Boise National Forest regs, no permitting was required if there were no fees or income derived from an activity, and if there were less than 75 people participating. I saw a path. I quickly came up with a new plan. I was going to serve coffee for absolutely free and exclusively on Boise National Forest lands within the Boise Foothills. And I was going to limit my coffee serving to 73 people and myself to stay under that 75-person total. I decided at this point, sometime in late April, that it would be best to go underground with this plan for the next few months until trails dried out and I could organize a coffee service. In the meantime, I found a coffee I liked and could purchase in bulk from a local roaster. I tested gear, and I got my mule used to working with me. When late May rolled around, I set up a Facebook and Instagram account at Richard the Mule. I would use these social media platforms to post a map and time window for where and when I would be serving coffee on the trails. I decided my first coffee service would be on Saturday, May 28th. I had decided I would wait until Friday to post my map because I didn't want to give too much time for anyone official to take notice and start maneuvering to shut me down. I felt like I was on pretty solid regulatory ground, but I also knew I didn't hold the power in this situation. In the weeks leading up to the coffee service, I let some close friends know what I was up to. I wanted to draw enough people to really test the concept, but I didn't want so many people that I couldn't keep up, as there was only so fast I could boil water and brew. I was aiming for a sort of soft opening before I knew what a soft opening really was. One of my acquaintances and a trail athlete who I'd told about my upcoming shenanigans apparently hadn't gotten the drift that I wanted to be sort of underground with this whole thing at first. On the Tuesday before my intended Saturday coffee service, he sent me an introduction email out of the blue. The other person on that email was Chad Cripe, the outdoor reporter for the Idaho Statesman. Chad followed up with a phone call with lots of questions that culminated with him asking if he could tag along for the first Trailside coffee service. At this, I figured the cat was going to be out of the bag, and I saw this as a chance to really highlight how positive and community building my intent was for this activity. I agreed to have him tag along. On Friday, the day before the big day, leveraging all the pre-mission planning I'd learned in years of military service, I did a full-on gear layout on my driveway, checking items off against the packing list I'd built over the past few months. I then packed it up, trailered my mule to the trailhead, hiked for an hour to the exact location I'd be going the next day, set everything up, and brewed myself a cup of coffee, ensuring to employ all the gear that I would need the very next day. I did a full dress rehearsal. After drinking the cup of coffee I brewed for myself and serving a cup of coffee to a rando that happened to be putting in a mid-morning trail run, I did everything in reverse to get home and ready for the next day. I was incredibly nervous to have the Statesman reporter tagging along. For one, it was going to be a long day for him. He was there as an observer, not a participant, and with only me to pack my mule and set up the operation, along with my desire to be in place and capable of operating at least 45 minutes before the time I had posted on social media, we had to start out extra early. Also, prior to meeting up, both of us would be traveling in areas without cell reception. Despite my fears, or at least a few of them, we met without a hitch Saturday morning, just as day broke at a trailhead that lies up a rough gravel road a few miles outside of Boise. I attempted to convey confidence and a sense that I was in full control, as if I'd done this many times before, as I tacked up Richard, lifted the 80-plus pound boxes of gear onto each side of him, lashed a foldable camp table on top of Richard's packs, and briefed Chad on the hour or so hike ahead. The hike was uneventful, and we got to the serving spot right on schedule. But then, things started to slow down a bit for me. It took me a bit longer than I wanted to get Richard unloaded and picketed. Then, it took me a bit longer than desired to get the coffee kitchen sorted. Mules can carry a lot of weight, but you are still space restricted with them. Put another way, take any large furniture item you have in your house. say a big chest of drawers, a dresser, or a TV cabinet. Just looking at how much those items weigh, most mules could single-handedly pack any of those items with ease. But you would really have a hard time figuring out how to put something that bulky on a mule in any sort of functional way. I had a lot of coffee-related gear and water with me, but I had been forced to pack it very carefully, just so, to get it to fit into 2 boxes that aren't much bigger than most people's microwaves. And all that careful packing had some implications. No number of hours wasted as an adolescent playing Tetris on a Game Boy or whatever spatial reasoning game the kids might play on their smartphones now could allow one to do anything with this gear without unpacking all of it entirely from the boxes, sorting it out on the fold-out table or the ground, and repacking non-immediate need items back into the boxes to get some semblance of organization going. This, too, took a bit longer than I'd hoped. I was still going to be set up close to on time, but had definitely eaten into my planned buffer. The table got set up, hand wash station was in place, filled with hot water I'd brought in and a thermos from home, completed with hand soap, paper towels, and a catch basin, and my hands were washed. Ground coffee, cups, kettle, pour-over cones, coffee filters, they all made it onto the table, as did sugar, an insulated container of half and half, and stir sticks. And then came the last and final piece, my beautiful, glossy orange clamshell stove. The stove was folded open. I attached the regulator to the stove. The regulator is the item that connects the green propane fuel bottles to the stove and helps take high-pressure fuel from the canisters and converts it into a lower pressure that the stove can handle. And then I threaded a fuel bottle onto the other end of the regulator. I was not as ahead of schedule as I wanted to be, but with luck, I would have water boiled soon and be serving people on time. It was go time. I filled a kettle with water from a jug popped up on the edge of my table, put the kettle on the stove, opened the gas knob up, maybe irresponsibly high for anyone in favor of arm hair or eyelashes, and I clicked the sparker switch to ignite the stove. And then, nothing happened. I hit the sparker again. Nothing happened. Then I realized, despite my irresponsibly wide open throttle on the gas knob, there was no familiar hiss from the stove. I wasn't in danger of singeing any body hair because no gas was coming out of my stove burner. This was a problem. Okay, maybe something is wrong with the burner. The stove has 2 of them. So I cranked the knob to send propane to the second burner and hit the sparker again. No joy. I knew gas was in both propane cylinders, the one I had screwed on and my backup. They were both heavy, and you can shake them and tell by weight and feel. But I switched the propane cylinders anyway, as this was the easiest thing to troubleshoot next. The new propane cylinder didn't do anything. The stove was still dead in the water. This problem was near unfathomable for me, as I just used the stove the day prior on my test run for this very purpose before carefully packing it back up. But the reality was the reality. I needed a stove to heat water. Without hot water, there would be no coffee. Without coffee, I would be an idiot with a mule and a notion of a coffee setup who would then be obliged to stand in place for the next 2.5 hours to tell anyone who had decided to hike up to this fairly remote location based off of my social media post that I was going to be a very humorous disappointment for them. I was fairly confident that Chad, the Statesman reporter, would not embarrass me by reporting a failure of this sort, but I also couldn't be certain of that either. It was time for a legit tactical pause and some thinking. The incentives for me to be successful, or at least the disincentives for me to fail, were crystal clear at this point. This part of the foothills has pretty much nothing in the way of trees. I was still in sagebrush scrub, so building a fire was out. It was stove or nothing. I knew I had full propane tanks. I could verify that. I strongly assumed the stove itself was trouble-free. It had 2 burners after all, and it would be odd for both of them to up and not work. I unscrewed the regulator from the stove and blew through the inner workings of the stove, and it seemed like my air was getting through. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem had to lie in the regulator. When I took the regulator off and connected it alone to a propane canister, my hunch was validated. Nothing came out of the other end. The end that would normally be hooked up to the stove, there should have been propane steadily gushing out without the stove connected. I had 2 of just about everything with me. In contrast, I had only 1 regulator, and I sort of really badly needed to fix this one, like right now, if not 30 minutes ago. I assumed the regulator was fairly simple, but I had never seen inside one. I'd never taken one apart, and I certainly had never tried to fix one. I also had a few other basic assumptions. The part of the regulator that did all the, regulating was roughly the size of a golf ball. That's small, which meant any parts inside were going to be even smaller, if not downright tiny. I also assumed, given how I thought regulators worked, that one of those small parts was going to be a spring. I was in the least preferable place on earth to do anything with anything that had a small spring. I was standing on a roughly 6 foot by 6 foot semi-flat patch of sandy ground on a hillside trail that was surrounded by grass and bushes to all sides. Losing anything in my immediate surroundings would be a death blow. I knew my regulator was currently not working, but I knew for damn sure it wouldn't work if I lost one of its small parts. I had a table with me, but the surface of my foldable table is made of about 20 thin aluminum slats with large gaps in between each slat, where anything pea-size or smaller could easily fall through to the ground. Looking around, I saw that the Statesman reporter had hiked a folding chair in with him. So in my only request of Chad all day, I asked if I could please borrow his chair. I set it up in the dead middle of my mostly level, grass-free area and knelt with both knees down in front of the chair, facing the backrest. I figured the backrest and my body could potentially block flying parts in at least 2 directions, and I would just have to take my chances with the big open air gaps underneath the armrests. I put the small regulator down as low as it would go in the seat of the chair, identified the only part that looked like it was threaded and could be twisted out, and ever so carefully began to unscrew it with my multi-tool while trying to block any escape routes with my hands. As feared, the part I was unthreading was under spring tension, but luckily I was able to contain it, the spring, and the few other small parts inside and restrain them enough to take note of what order they were in and how to reassemble them. As soon as I got all of the parts laid out in the chair, my problem was obvious. In addition to the parts that were clearly meant to be inside the regulator, there was a huge number of Rice Krispie-sized flakes of rust. I was real green at this, but I knew all that rust shouldn't be in there. I shook them out as best I could, inspected for more, put every piece possible to my mouth, and blew it off or blew through it, and quickly reassembled. With a bit of quick reflection, I came to the conclusion that the first bottle of propane I had used that day likely had these rust flakes in the cap or inside of it. They probably blew into the regulator and gummed it up as soon as I had attached it. So I went about hooking up the regulator to the stove and decided I would be avoiding what was likely a problematic fuel canister. I'd use the other one. I got all of it hooked up to the good fuel canister, cranked the knob on the stove open once again, hit the sparker, and we had liftoff. My adrenaline came down from a massive high while my heart soared. I could now get to boiling water, and at most, nobody would need to wait for more than about 5 minutes after my published start time for their coffee. The runners and hikers soon did start rolling in. I lost count in the excitement that morning, but we served somewhere between 30 and 50 trailgoers, some of them hardcore athletes, and a few of them out for a family adventure with their kids. I had to forcefully turn away tips to ensure my non-commercial status, but the offers alone were evidence that people valued what I was doing. For me, the ability to be generous was powerful, as was the gratitude that I received in return. It was downright addictive. I returned home that day after a roughly 12-hour effort, exhausted but very hooked. The following Wednesday, Chad Cripe published his article, but instead of having it in the outdoor section, we were featured with a massive photo as the top story on the front page of the state's largest newspaper. I went on to serve coffee and front the cost for doing so 18 weekends during the summer and fall of 2016. Richard and I became incredibly close as a team as we worked together through that first summer, and he truly taught me lessons I wasn't even aware I needed to learn yet. One thing he couldn't teach me that I eventually came to on my own was that giving away free coffee is not a sound business model, no matter how passionate you are. And this effort was taking me a lot of time throughout the week, not only the weekends. As no Forest Service or BLM districts had given me permission to support runners on their lands by early June, I canceled my pending outfitter's license and requested a refund for the money I could still get back. That door was pretty much shut, at least for that summer. Another door did start to open through our trail services when a rep from Whole Foods found us on the trail, loved what we were doing, and asked if we would be interested in bottling a Café Mulé cold brew coffee for sale in their store. They even offered to let us use their commercial kitchen space to get started. A coffee company seemed inevitable at this point, and therein lies a ton of other stories that are best left for another time. Thank you for listening today. In our show notes, you can find a link to the Ridge to Rivers Trail Organization, where you can read the meeting notes from February 4th, 2016, and find some people saying some truly ridiculous things. While you're on the site, we would encourage you to make a donation to the trails, as we often do. They aren't perfect, but they have provided us a pretty awesome trail network around Boise, and they are doing the best they can, at least for government work. Also in the show notes is a link to Chad Cripe's original Idaho Statesman article, A Man, His Mule, and a Dream of Trailside Coffee in Boise, along with links to a few other articles that reported on our first season in operations. And for all those bureaucrats who held me back in 2016, you owe my mule an apology. And as for me, I think you're all a bunch of dirty sons of...